Across the rolling hills of Henrico County, Virginia, where endless waves of tobacco fields shimmered under the blazing summer sun of 1784, the Caldwell family reigned over one of the Commonwealth's most prosperous plantations. To the outside world, they stood as the very image of post-revolutionary grace, wealthy, pious, and unshakably refined. Yet hidden within the walls of Mill Haven Estate lay a secret so grotesque that, when it finally clawed its way to the surface in the winter of 1789, it shattered the foundations of Virginia's aristocratic order. For more than 2 centuries, court documents remained sealed, preserving a tale of deception, forged identities, and a young woman who discovered her entire childhood had been nothing more than preparation for a purpose so unholy it defies belief. 23 witnesses came forward, recounting horrors so profound that 3 judges withdrew, confessing they lacked the moral strength to preside. Authorities tried to smother the scandal, the church declared it myth, and the surviving Caldwells vanished from Virginia forever. But truth, as it always does, could not remain buried. And when it surfaced, it changed everything. Before we unravel the forbidden story of Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell bloodline, know this: this channel is devoted to America's darkest histories, the tales too unsettling for your textbooks. If you're new, subscribe now and ring the bell so you'll never miss our weekly descent into the past's most chilling secrets. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? I love seeing where our growing community of mystery seekers is tuning in from. The remnants of this scandal were rediscovered only in 1892, when a clerk in Richmond stumbled across the forgotten files while cataloging archives. His notes to the Virginia Historical Society described the contents as too disturbing for public release, and the documents were sealed away for another half-century. But the story itself reaches back further, into the autumn of 1776, as Virginia staggered through revolution and the promise of a fragile independence. Mill Haven Estate, a sprawling 3,000-acre dominion of prime tobacco land, had been the Caldwell inheritance for 3 generations. Its foundation rested on a land grant signed in 1722 by Governor Alexander Spotswood, establishing the Caldwells among the elite of colonial Virginia. They maintained that power through careful marriages, ruthless business, and an unyielding devotion to protecting their fortune. At the helm stood Jonathan Caldwell, a man of towering influence, once a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, a merchant whose reach stretched from Richmond to London, and a widower since the death of his wife Catherine just months before independence was declared. At 42, Jonathan's commanding stature, steel-gray eyes, and presence of authority made him impossible to ignore. Catherine had been born a Harrison, of one of Virginia's founding families, her lineage tied to the earliest settlers at Jamestown. Her dowry and reputation had elevated the Caldwell name to the highest social circles, fusing 2 of the Commonwealth's richest tobacco dynasties. Though their marriage was brief, it was celebrated across Richmond as a union of unmatched power. The Revolution altered everything, old trade routes collapsed, fortunes crumbled, and only the cunning survived. Jonathan was among the first to see independence not as a cause for liberty, but as an opportunity for reinvention. While many planters clung to the crown, Jonathan gambled on the Revolution, striking deals with French merchants, demanding payment in gold and land when currency failed, and expanding Mill Haven by swallowing bankrupt estates at bargain prices. He thrived where others fell, but his triumph was haunted by a singular problem: he had no male heir. Without one, Mill Haven risked being torn apart and divided among distant relatives, a fate his grandfather had forewarned against in letters preserved in the family strongbox. "A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed," the old man had written. Keep the Caldwell name and the Caldwell land bound together, no matter the sacrifice. That burden weighed heavily on Jonathan's mind. He considered remarrying. Wealthy families whispered offers of their daughters, but the thought repelled him. Jonathan had grown used to complete control, and the idea of another wife with her own ambitions was intolerable. Worse, any new union would drag another family's loyalties into his house, threatening the singular purpose of the Caldwell legacy. What Jonathan needed was not a partner, but a vessel, someone bound to him completely, dependent on his protection, and incapable of betrayal. Fate, or perhaps design, delivered Elizabeth Hartwell into his path. One November night, as rain lashed the windows of Mill Haven's great house, Jonathan sat in his walnut-paneled study, candelabras flickering against rows of meticulously ordered books and documents. The plantation accounts before him told a story of unrivaled success. The tobacco harvest had surpassed expectations, French contracts yielded gold, and investments in Richmond property made him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. Yet unease gnawed at him. What good was a dynasty without continuity? Near midnight, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Samuel Bigham, his overseer of more than 2 decades, stepped inside, the same man who had served both Jonathan and his father before him. That night, as the storm gathered, so too did the events that would alter Virginia forever. Samuel Bigham's loyalty had never wavered. He was a man who asked no questions, carried out orders without hesitation, and kept secrets as faithfully as the grave. So when he stepped into Jonathan Caldwell's study that storm-lashed night, his voice carried a weight that instantly sharpened his master's attention. "Master Caldwell," he began, his tone edged with unusual gravity. "There's been an accident on the Richmond road. A carriage overturned in the storm. Appears to be quality folk, sir." Jonathan set down his quill with deliberate calm. Quality folk meant obligation, yes, but also possibility. "How far from our gates?" "Perhaps 2 miles, near Devil's Elbow, where the road bends by the creek." "The driver's dead." "The gentleman and lady as well." "Thrown clear when it rolled." "The horses bolted, but we secured the baggage." Bigham's pause stretched before he added, "There was a survivor. A child. A girl, maybe 11. Jonathan leaned back, his mind already calculating. Orphan children of standing could be useful, if properly guided. And her condition? Alive by sheer fortune. Tossed into the brush, likely saved her. She keeps asking for her Uncle Thomas, but she's in shock, sir. Remembers little else. Opportunity had arrived on Jonathan's doorstep. Any identification? Bigham's face hardened into the neutral mask Jonathan knew well, the look he wore when information required discretion. Documents in the man's coat. Name was William Hartwell. Traveling with his wife Margaret and their daughter. They carried gold, sir. A considerable sum, payment, it seems, for land in the Kentucky territories. Gold. The word seized Jonathan's interest. Yet it was the overseer's tone, careful and cautious, that promised more beneath the surface. "Bring the child to the house," Jonathan ordered. "Clean her, feed her, dress her warm. And Samuel," his eyes narrowed, heavy with unspoken meaning, "will speak further, in private." An hour later, Jonathan entered the guest room. There on the edge of a 4-poster bed sat the girl, swaddled in a nightgown Martha had found for her. Even in her distress, refinement showed in the way she folded her hands, in the soft dignity of her words when she thanked Martha for the milk, and in the quality of her soaked dress drying by the fire. But it was her face that stole Jonathan's breath. The child looked unerringly like Catherine, his late wife, around the eyes, the jaw, even the chestnut hair once it had been brushed and dried. And when she gazed up at him, wide-eyed and trembling, he felt a recognition that rattled him to the core. "What is your name, child?" Jonathan asked, lowering himself into the chair across from her, his voice touched with rare gentleness. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she whispered, her tone cultured, educated. "My parents, are they truly gone?" Samuel said, "An accident. But I thought perhaps," her voice drifted like smoke from a dying fire. Jonathan studied her, saw not only Catherine's shadow but also a keen spark in her eyes. This was no ordinary orphan. This was quality. And quality was opportunity. "I'm afraid so, my dear," he said softly, reaching to pat her hand in a fatherly gesture. "But you are safe here. Tomorrow, we'll make inquiries about this Uncle Thomas. We'll find your family and see you cared for." His words dripped sympathy. His thoughts, however, were anything but paternal. "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth murmured, her manners intact even through her grief. "You're very kind. I don't know what would have happened without your man." Jonathan smiled warmly, masking his designs. "Think nothing of it, my dear. It is a Christian duty to shelter the needy. And I suspect, you and I will grow very well acquainted indeed." That night, while Elizabeth slept under Martha's watchful eye, Jonathan and Bigham descended into the estate's wine cellar. Among barrels and candlelight, where no ears could overhear, they spoke. What was said in that chamber became the first stroke in a plan that would ripple across decades. Jonathan's first inquiry letter was written, and then quietly locked away. Instead, he began building a different narrative, one that would serve his ambitions perfectly. Through quiet investigation, Jonathan learned that William and Margaret Hartwell had indeed been bound westward, seeking relatives in Kentucky's remote mountains. Those kin lived so deep in the frontier that letters often vanished on wilderness roads, sometimes taking months to arrive, if they arrived at all. The Hartwells themselves were relative newcomers, Maryland transplants who had lived in Virginia for only 5 years, their shipping business modest, their circle small. Their sudden vanishing could easily be chalked up to frontier misfortune. And Jonathan, ever the strategist, seized this gap in oversight. Within weeks, forged documents painted a new tale. Uncle Thomas, conveniently struck by fever in the Kentucky wilds, was dead, leaving Elizabeth utterly without kin. Who but Jonathan, the respected Caldwell patriarch, could step forward to shield her? His reputation as a devout Christian lent credibility, and the county clerk, drowning in post-war disarray, accepted the papers without pause. Jonathan Caldwell was declared Elizabeth's guardian. His reputation soared with sympathy and praise. His true motives remained locked behind his steel-gray eyes. Elizabeth, grieving and cut off at Mill Haven's remote estate, soon grew dependent on Jonathan's care. He employed Miss Adelaide Fenwick, a prim and educated spinster, as her tutor, ensuring Elizabeth's refinement while keeping her firmly under his control. She was clothed richly, treated with courtesy, educated carefully, all while Jonathan's unseen hand molded her into something specific, something deliberate. Guardianship was only the beginning. In the winter of 1778, Jonathan made a journey to Richmond. There, in the polished offices of Cornelius Vance, his lawyer, his confidant, and a man whose profession thrived on silence, Jonathan set into motion legal maneuvers as audacious as they were sinister. Vance, discreet and unflinching, understood exactly the kind of client he served. And Jonathan's designs had only just begun to take shape. Cornelius Vance had built his career catering to the intricate, shadowed legal affairs of Virginia's plantation elite. His offices, occupying the second floor of a stately federal-style building on Main Street, reflected both refinement and secrecy, mahogany imported from the Indies, shelves heavy with leather-bound tomes detailing every nuance of inheritance law, marriage contracts, and the labyrinthine codes of property rights. It was here, amid polished wood and the scent of ink and parchment, that Jonathan Caldwell began laying the cornerstones of his most audacious design. The first step was simple but devastatingly effective: adoption. Vance drafted papers that transformed Elizabeth Hartwell into Elizabeth Caldwell, making her Jonathan's legal daughter and rightful heir to Mill Haven in the absence of other claimants. To outsiders, this was nothing more than the noble charity of a widower securing the future of an orphaned girl. To Jonathan, it was the perfect veil. The second step was far darker. Vance, paid well for his silence, composed a document that masqueraded as a standard marriage contract. But this one was unlike any other. It bore no bride's name, no fixed date, no details at all, only Jonathan Caldwell of Mill Haven Estate, bound someday to a woman of suitable breeding and education. Its vagueness was its genius, its omission deliberate. Vance did not question, and the contract remained tucked away in his private files, waiting for the hour when Jonathan would reveal his true intent. The adoption papers were dutifully filed with the county clerk, a matter of public record. The marriage contract, however, vanished into silence. As Elizabeth matured, Jonathan's control over her life grew suffocating in its thoroughness. French was taught by a private tutor, Latin by the minister, mathematics and literature by Miss Fenwick, and estate management by Martha, whose every task became a silent lesson in household command. Elizabeth learned to glide through the rigid etiquette of Virginia society, to read balance sheets as easily as poetry, to conduct herself as mistress of a great estate. To the neighbors, Jonathan's devotion was touching, the hallmark of a responsible guardian preparing a refined heiress for a respectable match. They admired him for it, never seeing the shadows beneath his paternal smile. But alongside the visible lessons, Jonathan wove in subtler teachings. He spoke often of the sacred obligation of family loyalty, of patriarchs in the Bible who took wives and concubines to preserve their bloodlines, of sacrifices demanded for survival, of ancestors who had fought and died for Caldwell land. He painted Elizabeth not as a ward under his care, but as a chosen vessel in a saga older than her. Her role, he whispered, was not only to continue the Caldwell name, but to embody it, intelligence, beauty, obedience, and loyalty fused into one living heirloom. Gradually, imperceptibly, Elizabeth's world narrowed until Jonathan was both her father and her destiny. By 1782, Elizabeth had blossomed into a young woman of rare beauty and sharp intelligence. At 16, she remained cut off from young men her age, isolated in a carefully crafted world where every path led back to Jonathan. Her thoughts of the future revolved not around dreams of her own choosing, but around the legacy Jonathan had conditioned her to uphold. Then came the spring of 1784. Jonathan, his plan nearly complete, delivered the final revelation. He told Elizabeth of a distant cousin, another Jonathan Caldwell, who wished to arrange a union between their branches of the family. The marriage, he explained, would safeguard the estate's future and honor the generations who had built it. It was, he assured her, the fulfillment of years of careful design. On a warm April morning, he placed before her a small portrait in an ornate golden frame. Painted with delicate care, the man within bore a striking likeness to Jonathan himself, the same unyielding jaw, the same piercing eyes, the same aura of authority radiating even from canvas. Elizabeth's breath caught as she studied it, unease growing with every detail. The clothing seemed old-fashioned, the pose stiff, as though from another time. Most troubling of all was the uncanny resemblance, as if this man were not a cousin at all, but Jonathan's reflection made flesh. "His name is Jonathan Caldwell," her adoptive father said evenly, his gaze fixed on her reaction. "A cousin from the western counties. A man of character and means. This union will bind our family holdings and preserve Mill Haven for generations to come." Elizabeth hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. "But Papa," she murmured, the old term of affection slipping out instinctively, "his name is the same as yours. Is that not unusual?" Jonathan's reply came with practiced ease, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had prepared every word. It was common, he explained, for cousins to share names in honor of ancestors. This cousin had built wealth in the Shenandoah Valley but lacked refinement and standing. Their marriage would elevate him socially while securing Elizabeth's future and consolidating the Caldwell fortune. It was, he concluded, the perfect arrangement. Elizabeth's lips trembled. "But I would be leaving you," the distress in her voice pleased him more than her gratitude ever had. For years he had cultivated her dependence, ensuring the thought of separation felt unbearable. He leaned closer, his tone cloaked in gentle affection, though beneath it pulsed something darker. "Not leaving, my dear. Expanding our family. You will always be here, always close. The arrangement ensures your husband will spend much of his time at Mill Haven, managing our estates side by side. You need never be apart from those who love you most." The preparations began, though not with the grand spectacle of Virginia's usual plantation weddings, no weeks of feasts, no endless procession of guests. Instead, something quieter, stranger, and altogether more unsettling took shape within the walls of Mill Haven, as Jonathan's hidden plan slid ever closer to its revelation. The wedding was never meant to be a spectacle. Jonathan had insisted it would be a private affair at Mill Haven, witnessed only by a handful of carefully chosen attendees. His reasoning seemed flawless. Virginia's prominent families were still scattered by war, travel was perilous, and the groom's family, so he claimed, preferred a modest ceremony unclouded by distractions from the financial negotiations tied to the settlement. Elizabeth's orphan status, he added, demanded restraint. A subdued wedding was dignified. Anything more would be insensitive to her loss. At least, that was the explanation he gave her. But as summer bled into autumn, doubt began gnawing at Elizabeth. Invitations, she was told, had been sent to distant Caldwell relatives and to the groom's family, but no replies ever arrived at Mill Haven. When she asked to see the letters herself, Jonathan explained smoothly that such correspondence was being routed through his lawyer in Richmond. When she requested permission to write her intended husband, Jonathan offered another polished excuse. The man was away on business in the Western Territories, preferring to maintain the old-fashioned formality of distance before marriage. Such restraint, he assured her, was not coldness but respect. Her unease deepened in September, when Cornelius Vance himself arrived from Richmond in a hired carriage, leather portfolios and mahogany cases stacked at his feet. He presented Elizabeth with papers, inheritance deeds, marriage settlements, contracts linking two Caldwell estates into one unified dominion. Yet when she tried to read them carefully, Vance's measured voice dismissed her efforts. "These are formalities," he assured her. "Standard protections of Virginia law. Your father and I have ensured every detail safeguards your future." Jonathan echoed him with paternal warmth, urging her to trust, not to trouble her mind with legal complexities. One deed, however, caught her attention, a transfer of her inheritance as Jonathan's adopted daughter into other hands. Alarmed, she questioned it. Jonathan's explanation came too easily. "Merely a change in legal status," he said smoothly. "When you marry, you cease to be my daughter-in-law and become my daughter-in-law. These papers only reflect that." His words were crafted to soothe, but Elizabeth was no longer a child. Jonathan himself had educated her in history, mathematics, and law, enough that she could see through the fog. The documents were deliberately obscure. The timing, rushed. The explanations, evasive. The more she considered them, the less they aligned with reason. The truth broke through one cold October evening. Unable to sleep, nerves twisted by the looming wedding, she wandered the silent halls of Mill Haven and pushed open the study door. Expecting darkness, she instead found Jonathan seated at his desk, candlelight glinting off neat rows of papers and silver candelabras. Shadows of stern Caldwell ancestors loomed from their portraits, watching. At first, she thought nothing of the scene, until her eyes caught the portrait of her supposed fiancé lying on the desk. Beside it rested a mirror angled just so, reflecting Jonathan's own face. She froze as she watched him adjust his hair, tilt his jaw, even school his expression to match the painted likeness. Practicing. Molding his features into those of the man in the miniature. Her blood turned cold. The resemblance had never been coincidence. It was identity. The cousin did not exist. There had never been a cousin. The man she was meant to marry was Jonathan himself. She slipped back silently, her heart thundering so loudly she feared he would hear. Her mind reeled, the monstrous truth forming even as she resisted it. The invitations, the excuses, the evasions, everything fell into place. He meant to marry her under a false name, weaving a legal fiction to mask the abomination. He had built an elaborate facade of adoption and guardianship only to transform it into something unspeakable. Over the following days, Elizabeth's fear hardened into determination. Using the very skills Jonathan had trained into her, observation, analysis, patience, she began her own investigation. She rifled through household correspondence under the pretext of lessons with Miss Fenwick, listened intently to Martha's murmured accounts of wedding preparations, and pieced together fragments of truth. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. There were no letters from any cousin. Only communications from Vance, instructing secrecy about the unusual ceremony. Bills from a Richmond portraitist detailing modifications to an existing miniature. Payments to tailors and merchants for clothing and accessories designed to alter a man's appearance. Then came the breakthrough. While Jonathan was away on business, Elizabeth slipped into his study. Armed with a hairpin and lessons learned from watching Martha repair locks, she opened a drawer she had long seen him guard. Inside lay the skeleton of his deception, the unsent inquiry letters about her parents, the forged guardianship documents, the fabricated correspondence from the fictional cousin. And worse, Jonathan's own notes, written in his unmistakable hand, detailing his plans for their wedding night and the years beyond. But one document eclipsed them all. A marriage contract, in Vance's precise legal script. The names leapt at her like a brand: Jonathan Caldwell of Mill Haven Estate, Henrico County, and Elizabeth Hartwell, his legally adopted daughter. No cousin. No fiction. No veil left at all. The horror was complete. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. The contract Elizabeth held left no doubt: the groom and the guardian were one and the same. Jonathan Caldwell. Her adoptive father. The revelation struck her like ice water poured down her spine, leaving her trembling as she sat in his chair, staring at the cruel precision of the documents. Every kindness, every lesson, every tender word of paternal affection had not been love, it had been preparation. She had not been raised. She had been groomed. Groomed to inherit his fortune. Groomed to secure his name. Groomed to become his bride. The legal brilliance of it chilled her even more than its depravity. By adopting her, Jonathan had secured her inheritance rights and cemented his paternal control. By marrying her, he would bind the estate to himself while ensuring their children were viewed as legitimate heirs to the Caldwell fortune. In Virginia's rigid world of bloodlines and property, his design was monstrous, but not necessarily unlawful. It was the kind of plan only a mind steeped in power and entitlement could conceive, and carry out without fear of consequence. His private notes made her stomach twist. They described, in clinical detail, how their union would be presented as perfectly ordinary. Away from Mill Haven, they would simply appear as a wealthy planter and his young wife. The adoption papers would vanish into silence. The marriage license would carry only their names. Their children would never know. To the world, nothing would appear amiss. To Elizabeth, it meant a lifetime of entrapment, of unspeakable violation hidden beneath respectability. That night, she lay awake in her bed, paralyzed by despair. Escape was impossible. Jonathan had severed every tie she might have had to the outside world. No friends. No allies. No wealth of her own. Even if she found the courage to speak out, the very documents he had engineered would betray her, painting her as complicit in his arrangement. The wedding loomed, November 15th, barely 3 weeks remained before the trap snapped shut forever. Then, on November 3rd, hope arrived, unexpected, unbidden, like an answer to a prayer. A traveling minister, Reverend Thomas Hartley, appeared at Mill Haven's gates seeking shelter on his circuit through Virginia's countryside. His surname, Hartley, struck Elizabeth like a spark in the dark. Could this man be a thread to her true family? Hartley was a man of 50, his hair graying, his skin weathered from years on the road. He dressed plainly, yet carried himself with dignity, and as he spoke over dinner beneath the watchful portraits of Caldwell ancestors, Elizabeth listened with breathless intensity. He spoke of scattered parishes, baptisms and burials, the endless miles he traveled to serve frontier communities. His knowledge of Virginia's families was deep, intimate, gathered from a lifetime of ministering to them. When Jonathan stepped away to speak with Samuel Bigham about accommodations, Elizabeth seized her chance. Her voice trembled with cautious restraint as she leaned toward the minister. "Reverend Hartley, do you know of a family called Hartwell? They may be relations of mine." The minister's lined face lit with recognition. "Indeed I do, child. William and Margaret Hartwell, God rest their souls. Taken far too soon in that carriage accident. Good Christian folk, and often in my congregation when business brought them to Norfolk. They spoke often of their daughter, Elizabeth, bright child, destined to live with Margaret's brother in Kentucky after their affairs were settled. Thomas Whitfield was his name, though Margaret kept her maiden name for property reasons. Last I heard, he ran a post near Harrodsburg. still hoping for word of his sister's family. He's been quite troubled at their silence. Elizabeth's hands gripped the table, her composure crumbling. Everything Jonathan had told her, about an Uncle Thomas dead in the wilderness, was a lie. Her mother's brother was alive. Searching. Waiting. She had family. She was not alone. But before she could speak again, Jonathan re-entered the dining room, and the moment passed. That night, Elizabeth made her choice. She would not run blindly into the night, nor plead for mercy. She would confront him, gather undeniable proof, and entrust it to Reverend Hartley. If the minister carried word to Richmond, she might finally break the prison Jonathan had built around her life. When the house fell silent, she crept through Mill Haven's corridors, candle in hand, and found Jonathan in his study, just as she expected. Papers lay before him in neat military rows, contracts, forged correspondence, the blueprint of her entrapment. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway, pale in her white nightgown, and his expression flickered from surprise to something far darker. Cold, predatory calculation filled his steel-gray eyes. She felt her knees weaken, but her voice held steady. "There is no cousin," she said, the words slicing the silence. "There never was. You mean to marry me yourself?" Jonathan's mask fell away. No trace of fatherly affection remained. Rising slowly from his chair, his tall frame cast monstrous shadows across the paneled walls. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated," he said evenly. "Yes. There is no cousin. And yes, within 12 days, you will be my wife. My daughter. My heir. And the mother of the next generation of Caldwells. An arrangement that serves us all perfectly." Elizabeth's breath caught, but she forced herself to reply. "All, except me." Jonathan's smile was sharp and glacial, the light of the candles reflecting off eyes void of warmth. "Your interests are my interests, Elizabeth. They always have been. From the night I found you alone on the Richmond road. Did you truly think your rescue was an accident? That I raised you out of simple Christian charity?" The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow, confirming the darkest suspicion she had never dared fully name. She had not been saved. She had been claimed. Elizabeth's voice trembled as the truth formed on her lips. "The carriage accident, you knew of it before it happened." Jonathan's reply was chillingly casual, as if commenting on the weather. "I arranged it. Your parents traveled with a small fortune, payment for land in Kentucky. My men were instructed to stop the carriage, seize the gold. But you," his eyes gleamed as though recalling a divine revelation, "you were the true prize. When I saw how much you resembled my beloved Catherine, I knew Providence had gifted me something far greater than money. You were destiny." The world tilted. Elizabeth felt bile rise in her throat as the horror solidified. Her parents had not perished in some cruel accident. They had been murdered on Jonathan's orders, butchered for gold. She had not been saved on that stormy night. She had been stolen. Every moment of her life since, the lessons, the affection, the protection, had been a calculated grooming for a fate too vile to comprehend. "The law will not allow this," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, she knew the futility of invoking justice in a world where women had no rights apart from the men who claimed them. Jonathan's laugh rolled through the study, deep and amused, echoing beneath portraits of ancestors who seemed to leer in flickering candlelight. "The law, my dear, is nothing more than ink on paper, and men like me decide what it means. You are legally my daughter. That gives me absolute authority until you marry. And once you marry, you will be my wife. Still under my authority, still mine. The papers are signed, witnessed, filed. Virginia has no law that can touch us." He stepped closer, brandy on his breath, his cold eyes fixed on her like shackles. "And remember this, you have nowhere to go. Your uncle believes you died with your parents. You have no friends, no fortune, no name beyond mine. Even if you fled, you would be nothing but a penniless orphan with no proof of who you are. But Jonathan had overlooked one thing. He had underestimated the mind he himself had sharpened. For 13 years, Elizabeth had studied under him, learning mathematics, law, literature, and the subtler arts of observing men. And in his pride, Jonathan revealed everything. Pride, she realized, was his greatest weakness. And pride could be weaponized. She lowered her eyes, softening her voice with feigned surrender. "You are right," she murmured. "I have no choice but to obey. But, before I resign myself, tell me how you managed it. How did you know my parents carried so much money? How did you arrange the ambush so perfectly?" Jonathan's expression shifted, pleasure flickering across his features like a hunter savoring his kill. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the chance to boast. "Your father was a fool. He spoke too freely in Norfolk taverns. Everyone knew he carried gold to buy Kentucky land. All I needed was to know his road, his timetable. The rest was child's play." He smirked, pride dripping from every word. "And Providence rewarded me. It gave me you." Elizabeth's heart pounded, but outwardly she remained composed, committing every word to memory. She had no weapon, no physical power to resist him, but she had something else. Upstairs slept a witness who could not be ignored, Reverend Hartley, a man of the cloth, whose testimony before magistrates would carry undeniable weight. If she could place Jonathan's words before him, if she could produce evidence of his crimes, his empire of lies might finally collapse. And so, the stage was set. What followed would haunt Henrico County for generations. Whispers of it endured long after Mill Haven's fields grew wild with weeds. On November 15, 1789, the morning chosen for the unholy wedding, the estate erupted in a chaos that shattered the Caldwell dynasty forever. Elizabeth's plan, born from desperation and sharpened by the very education Jonathan had forced upon her, was elegant in its simplicity. For 12 nights she had not surrendered but prepared, moving silently through Mill Haven's halls, memorizing Jonathan's routines, copying his incriminating papers when his back was turned, and compiling the kind of evidence that could damn him even in the highest courts. Forged guardianship records. Letters from a cousin who never existed. Financial ledgers showing payments to the men who had slaughtered her parents. And Jonathan's own damning notes, his handwriting spelling out her future as his wife, his broodmare, his prize. But evidence alone could not topple a man like Jonathan Caldwell. Wealth, power, and reputation could bury documents as easily as the graves he had already filled. Elizabeth needed more. She needed witnesses. She needed the truth unveiled in a place so public, so sacred, that denial would be impossible. And so she chose the wedding itself, the very altar of her violation, as the stage for his destruction. The ceremony was held in Mill Haven's Great Hall. Reverend Charles Peden, an aging minister, presided, his voice heavy with the solemn cadence of Scripture. Around them gathered Cornelius Vance, neighboring planters, and their wives, magistrates, and members of Richmond's gentry, all believing they were about to witness an unusual but not unheard of union between a widowed guardian and his adopted daughter. Property, after all, often trumped propriety in Virginia's aristocracy. Elizabeth appeared in a gown of ivory silk, once worn by Catherine Caldwell herself, it seems altered to her form. Pearls from Catherine's wedding glimmered in her hair. To the guests, she was the very image of a pale, composed bride, nervous perhaps, but dutiful, resigned to her role. Jonathan stood beside her in midnight blue wool and crisp white linen, his satisfaction radiating like a crown of arrogance. At last, his triumph was within reach, a marriage that preserved his estate, his bloodline, his legacy, while mocking every moral law of God and man. Reverend Peden's voice echoed through the great hall, intoning the sacred vows that had bound countless couples before them. The guests settled into the ritual's familiar rhythm, comforted by its ancient gravity. To them, this was just another plantation wedding, unusual, perhaps, but respectable enough. None saw the storm gathering beneath Elizabeth's calm gaze, nor the reckoning she was about to unleash. The moment arrived when Reverend Peaton's voice rang out the familiar words that had bound countless unions before: "If any man can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined, let him now speak, or forever hold his peace." Silence hung thick, until Elizabeth's voice cut through it, steady and clear. "I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses," she declared. Every head turned as her words struck the hall like thunder. "I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell. And this man murdered my parents for their gold and stole me as his captive to become what you see here today." The hall erupted in chaos. Jonathan tried at once to dismiss her claims, his voice oily with feigned calm. She was nervous, hysterical, overcome by bridal fears, he insisted. But Elizabeth had prepared too carefully to be silenced. With the poise of a lawyer presenting evidence, she produced the documents she had gathered in secret and placed them before Reverend Peaton and the assembled magistrates. One by one, damning truths unfolded: forged adoption papers, correspondence in Jonathan's own hand plotting her parents' deaths, financial ledgers showing payments to Samuel Bigham for the ambush, meticulous notes describing her grooming for this unholy marriage. Each artifact was undeniable. Each one a nail in Jonathan's coffin. But Elizabeth was not finished. She drew one final blade of truth. "There is yet another crime," she announced, her voice unwavering. "Catherine Caldwell, Jonathan's first wife, did not die in childbirth as you have long believed. I found her diary in the cellar, alongside letters from Dr. Marcus Fleming of Richmond describing symptoms of arsenic poisoning. She died not of nature, but by her husband's hand, when she threatened to expose his affairs and ruin him in society." Gasps swept the hall. The charge of uxoricide, wife murder, combined with evidence of parental murder and kidnapping, was too monstrous to be denied. Several of the witnesses were magistrates themselves. With grim authority, they ordered Jonathan Caldwell placed under arrest on the spot. His protests, his pleas of conspiracy and feminine madness, were drowned beneath the weight of proof. The predator had been unmasked. The trial that followed in Richmond became the scandal of an era. Crowds thronged from Philadelphia to Boston to hear every sordid detail. Jonathan's defense, that Elizabeth was unstable, that documents were forgeries, that envious servants conspired against him, collapsed beneath the mountain of evidence and Elizabeth's calm, intelligent testimony. For the first time, even Virginia's elite recoiled from one of their own. Jonathan Caldwell stood revealed not as a Christian patriarch, but as a murderer, kidnapper, and predator. He was convicted on all counts: the murder of William and Margaret Hartwell, the poisoning of his wife Catherine, kidnapping and false imprisonment, and fraud. The sentence was death. On March 15, 1790, Jonathan Caldwell was hanged in Richmond before a crowd that once had bowed to his power. His body swung where once his word had ruled. Elizabeth inherited Mill Haven, the estate of her captivity, and with it the power Jonathan had sought to control. She used it not for wealth or vanity, but to find her true kin. After months of searching with the help of federal marshals, she reached the Kentucky frontier and embraced her uncle Thomas Whitfield, the man Jonathan had claimed was dead. Their reunion was raw, weeping, joyous. At last, she belonged to her family again. But Elizabeth was not the same girl she had been. 13 years of manipulation had left scars. She refused every marriage proposal that came to her. Her beauty, her intelligence, her inheritance drew suitors, but the thought of surrendering herself to another man's authority was unbearable. Instead, she turned her suffering into purpose. With her fortune, Elizabeth founded schools for orphans across Virginia and Kentucky. These were not merely places of learning but havens of protection, where no child could be exploited by those who claimed to care for them. She demanded safeguards, legal protections, systems of accountability, proof of guardians' legitimacy. Her vision helped shape child welfare in the young republic. Generations would grow under protections born of her pain. Elizabeth Hartwell died in 1847 at the age of 81, surrounded not by children of her own blood, but by hundreds whose lives she had saved. Governors, senators, reformers, and common folk alike came to honor her funeral, saluting a woman who had turned horror into hope. As for Mill Haven, it passed into ruin. Sold to cover debts and compensation, its once grand halls stood empty until they fell to decay. Locals whispered that crops would not grow on its soil, that animals shied from its fields. The land became forest, its foundations buried in roots and silence. Only stones remain, forgotten markers of the evil once plotted there. The Caldwell name vanished, relatives scattering, ashamed, their legacy dissolved into dust. Respectability could not protect them. Not from truth. Samuel Bigham swung from the gallows 6 months later, his complicity sealing his fate. Cornelius Vance fled but was captured, stripped of his profession, imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy. Their downfall became a parable in law schools and seminaries, a testament to corruptions wrought when power shields evil. Elizabeth's courage became a symbol to reformers who would carry her cause onward. Proof that one woman's defiance could collapse an empire of deceit. This story reminds us that evil often wears the mask of piety and respectability, that the powerless can be twisted by those who claim to protect them, and that courage, even in the darkest hour, can rip away those masks. Elizabeth Hartwell's stand destroyed a predator, reshaped the laws of her time, and saved countless children yet unborn. What do you think, my friends? Could such deception truly have thrived in the fragile legal chaos of post-revolutionary America? And where did Elizabeth find the strength to risk everything when she had no assurance of victory? Leave your thoughts below. If this dark tale gripped you, subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy and ring the bell, so you never miss our journeys into America's most chilling, hidden histories.